Patrick.
Hey, Katie.
So, what's your most unpopular neuroscience take?
Oh, probably that we already know everything about the brain and everyone just needs to stop getting neuroscience degrees.
Welcome to the first episode of Unpopular Neuroscience, where we plan to explore the popular imagination and the unpopular reality of some of our favorite fundamentals of neuroscience. I'm Katie McAllister. I have a BSc in Cognitive Systems, Cognition and the Brain from the University of British Columbia, and a PhD in Experimental Psychology and Neuroscience from the University of Cambridge. I've spent 8 years as a professor of complex systems, cognitive neuroscience, and the science of teaching and learning. And as an undergrad, I got worms drunk for science to see if they could remember things they learned when they were hammered.
I'm Patrick Watson. I have a Bachelor's of Science in Molecular Biology. I have a PhD in Computational Neuroscience from the University of Illinois. I'm currently a professor of machine learning in the Computer Science Department at Minerva University, and I used to work at IBM Watson's Research Center, where I was in AI for Education, which essentially means teaching robots to cheat on multiple choice tests. So one of the reasons that we came up with this idea for a podcast is we both taught seminars about neuroscience to undergraduates, and we would spend a lot of our time and a lot of our thinking kind of navigating through their very interesting understandings, which differ from our understandings as people who'd been in the discipline for 10 years. And we really wanted to kind of understand and unpack some of these weird ideas that are floating around the public consciousness that got popular about neuroscience, and think about a little bit about how we think about it that's different, or if there's anything interesting that we can add. So I guess the straightforward question is, Katie, what was so popular about neuroscience that made you interested in it when you got into it?
Yeah, it was over by the time I made it to university, but I still remember my professors talking about that whole decade of the brain idea from the 90s. And I think the impact of that initiative was still very apparent when I was there, trying out different majors and trying to decide what I wanted to be when I grew up. You know, it was a time when neuroscience had just grown like crazy. There's an article in Science looking back on the decade of the brain saying, look, there were 1,000 new members being added to the Society for Neuroscience every year. And the number of publications of basic neuroscience disciplines were increasing really staggering rates in Nature and other major journals. And looking back, Nature highlighted two trends related to this decade of the brain idea that I think were part of what really sucked me into it very strongly. The first was this growing awareness of the individual, social, and kind of economic burdens of cognitive disorders and neurodegenerative diseases. And we were in societies where they're looking at aging populations and saying, whoa, we always thought that this mattered, but it really, really matters. And so it was really coming to sort of popular attention, and with that social dimension to it as well. I think the other side of that really goes hand in hand was there was this almost increasing optimism and confidence in the research community that these kinds of topics are now a tractable problem. That if we take things like Parkinson's or depressive disorders or schizophrenia or stroke or age-related cognitive decline, they're now seen as things that maybe we can actually make meaningful progress on. Not even maybe, like we can make meaningful progress in these areas and have a really positive impact. So with that, it was just straight up an exciting time to be in neuroscience. fMRI had come online through the 90s. They'd imaged all the things. Genetics was coming to the forefront. There were really interesting findings around plasticity and neurogenesis and neuropsychopharmacology. And it just became this maelstrom of like, wow, all of this stuff is going on. You can have a positive impact. Change is going to happen. Join us now and be a part of this. And as a budding young neuroscientist, that really got me right in there saying, this is so cool and really what I want to be a part of. So that was sort of a bit more of the biological, biomedical perspective in a way. And maybe, Patrick, like, what got you roped into this?
I mean, I think that the brand is actually fairly consistent, and I guess our students are telling us that it's been consistent across time, that it's like this cool thing, there's just about to be all these big discoveries, there's just about to be this emergence of cool stuff. That was definitely present for me. I think that because I come from maybe a little more of a CS-oriented side of things, I did a lot of the medical stuff you said actually resonates with me as well. I was in molecular biology originally and did a lot of pharmacology stuff and was looking at like neuroregeneration for a little while before I kind of got over on the more computational side. The thing that was really attractive to me is there had actually been, kind of in the late 80s and early 90s, a lot of work by what at the time were mostly called like connectionists, was kind of the name for it, but what we now know as neural networks. And there were a couple of seminal books published on the most famous one probably being massively distributed. It's this is a title, massively distributed parallel processing by David Remmelhart and Jay McClellan, which was about how would you build a computer out of all of these tiny little individual processors. How would you wire them together to get them to do interesting functions? How would you change their connectivity to get them to learn to do new things? And so those learning rules were mostly laid out in the 80s and 90s in that decade of the brain that you're talking about. And so on the CS side as well, there was this idea that okay, this stuff was really interesting. So I remember reading that book and a couple of other related sources, and I had taken a neural networks class in undergraduate that was very influential to me. And actually, the teacher of that class was one of the members of my advisory committee when I went into a PhD. So that was a big influence on me. And then I think that the other element was that there was a lot of, this was kind of early in the Obama administration, there was a lot of funding available because the Brain Initiative happened at that time, which was another one of these decades-long pushes that was kicked off using almost exactly the same language as the Decade of the Brain, which was, hey, we're gonna, hey, we just throw some money at this problem and we'll work out the brain. So it was possible. It sort of was possible to be a graduate student at that time, to get funding, to do research in that area. And that was one of the major stuff under that Brain Initiative heading, was some of the major vehicles that I had the opportunity to pursue different kinds of neuroscience projects over my graduate school career. So we were going to talk a little bit at this point about where we see the field now and kind of what is the, like, now we're on the other end of it, right? Like now we're not the bright young neuroscientists anymore. Now we're like interacting with them and like what it must have been like for our advisors. Maybe I don't know. Maybe it was exactly like this. It seems like this perpetual sort of stability. What do you think?
Oh, I'm certain this is the perpetual stability, and I think it's where I think of the questions that come up in my classes, and they're wonderful questions, and they're so much fun to dive into. They're questions that I could have seen myself asking when I was a student, for sure, and they're very much grounded, I think, in this, excitement and the big framing and the possibility that we see in the field. And you and I have talked a little bit, and there's sort of like a taxonomy of kinds of popular framings that we often encounter. And I would
Yeah.
say this is not just my students. This is like interacting with my mother and her friends and family and people. When you're at a party and they're like, "Oh, you're a neuroscientist." Well, then come the wonderful questions, but they're often questions that you sort of pause for a second before you dive in. And I think it'd be good to maybe get into the reasons for that pause, because I think that's something we want to really start to unpack together.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with me. It's very interesting and different from if you said you were a physicist or if you said you were a historian. People would sort of assume that, okay, that's a discipline where things are kind of known and worked out. And if they ask you a question, they would probably use a question that was originally sort of a question that a historian or a physicist might ask. Well, it might not be a sophisticated version of it, but people would ask you like, oh, what era of history do you study? Right? And I've never been asked what part of the brain do you study? Even though that's a very salient question that a neuroscientist would have an answer to. No one ever asked that. They don't know the parts of the brain. Like there isn't broad knowledge of like the parts of the brain. Maybe the hippocampus is like the only thing that people have heard of. Maybe. And yes, I did study it, so like I could totally talk about that. But they never ask, someone might ask you like, oh, do you study the history of Rome or something like that? And so there's this weird, this interesting thing going on with the brain where people can kind of point to it, they can reference it, but they don't have any of the internal workings of it in a way that would allow them to ask the kind of next salient question. Even when that question is really straightforward, like, oh, surely you don't study the whole thing. Sure, that's not a thing that someone could do, right? That's not even a broadly understood element of it. And you have similar questions, like you get similar questions like this, I think.
I do get that question.
Oh, cool.
And with my PhD work, I could say, oh, I study schizophrenia. Like, oh, amazing. But as you say, the next logical question that actually gets into like, what is the label of schizophrenia sitting above and all the complexity below it, very hard to then get into. Mm-hmm. Or, you get the follow-up of, or you're going to cure schizophrenia, or are you going to cure Alzheimer's, or when are you and your colleagues going to this? And you go like, oh, that's probably not
right.
I think if I'm a biologist and they say, oh, you're going to cure cancer, I think they immediately have to pause and be like, well, we have to talk about what that label even means before we can get into it further. So I think as a biologist, and I have to be careful because I'm not really a biologist. I did a very interdisciplinary undergraduate degree headed up by the late, great Eric Vitigiotis-Bateson, who saw this idea of combining linguistics, psychology, philosophy, and computer science together to kind of get at these questions. So I got to dabble in all of that. But I certainly see what I'd call the popular uncertainty framing of the field and neuroscience, where it plays into just the things that sucked me into it. So I don't want to sound like this is something I'm dunking on, because it's a
Mm-hmm.
wonderful and exciting rallying cry, but kind of that the majestic incomprehensibility of the brains, like the cosmos. It's where you get those statements, some sort of truth, some problematic of, oh, you only use 10% of your brain because it's so complex, or there's more neurons in a single human brain than stars in the Milky Way. And it's all very inspiring. Sometimes it's almost pessimistic, and that you have to take a step back and say, but are you kind of saying that we can't make sense of this? Like my heart of hearts hopes we can make some meaningful progress here. So I think that kind of popular uncertainty is something that is used a lot in our field, particularly sort of the popular imagination. But it's something you want to kind of take a step back from and say, well, wait a second, what are these claims? Or to your point, like,
Mm.
wait, are we studying the whole brain, or what's really going on here? And I'll bet there's some similar framings, sort of that popular uncertainty in your flavor of it as well.
I absolutely agree. The way that I see that creeping in, it most often comes, I think, from kind of from the CS side and you see it a lot in the discourse right now around artificial intelligence, is probably the most
Mm-hmm.
straightforward example, because artificial intelligence is also a completely ill-defined, vague term. It has the same qualities as the brain. It's like it's it's wild that these concepts got so popular without being unpacked. And so it's very strange that, because most concepts don't work like that. Most concepts, like if someone, as it gets more popular, you get more and more access to what's inside and more understanding, and it just becomes more, there's more popular knowledge about it laying around on the ground. Even advanced technologies like the iPhone or something like that, right? If you got into the iPhone, you would be like, oh, okay, it has this kind of a battery and it's made in this place, and here's how I compare it to other computers. Like, details about it, and that's part of what makes it, part of what drives engagement with it. As you get more engaged and more excited about it, you unpack the details of it. And with the brain and with artificial intelligence, it almost seems like it's not that way. The straightforward narrative about artificial intelligence is the big artificial intelligence boom that is in the news right now comes almost entirely just from a couple of large language models. Maybe you can also throw in DALL-E, like an image generator, and all of those are transformer based generative models. And the paper on those was published in 2017, and I read it at the time, and everybody in the field was like, "Oh, that's very clever, right? You could, yeah, that's a very smart way to allocate your training budget, right?" And I bet that would allow you to parallelize a lot of these big tasks, and all big companies immediately picked up with it and started working on their various instantiations, which is why every company kind of has their own version of it right now, because they've been working on it for 8 years now. But then the public discourse was driven entirely by the kind of product that came out at the end of that pipeline, without a lot of access to kind of, every person who is in machine learning was like just kind of watching that progress. But they may have not even been that super interested in it, because they're like, okay, well, it's a narrow thing. You could generate text with it, you could generate images with it, and text and images are great things to be able to generate. There were a lot of people working on audio generation is now kind of getting up there, video generation is kind of getting up there. But there are other people who are just working on other things, like naming objects and classifying things. Totally different thing. Totally doesn't have anything to do with the generative process, or need not have anything to do with generative process. And so it didn't excite everybody. Not everybody was following along with it, because because they had all of these subdivisions in the field, just like pieces of the brain. And so it's weird that the public discourse is like, oh my God, it's going to change everything. And I'm like, it's going to change literally just this one thing. It's literally just a text generator. And that's a very powerful thing, and has a lot of consequences. If you want to talk about the economic impact of it and things like that, that's definitely a thing. But just like in the brain, it's like this big, vague thing that there's almost
Mm-hmm.
no ability to ask a second question about, because you're like, oh, well, what do you think about, like, do you think that these generative models will be able to make inferences about other things, and how would that work if they were doing it? And then even that level of engagement, which is, to someone who understands how the guts of those things are working, a very like low level question, very abstract question. It's almost like, oh, that's not part of what artificial intelligence is. Artificial intelligence is this umbrella term that means that we don't have to ask questions about what goes on in it. And I think it's exactly the same as in the brain, and probably for more or less the same reasons. That it has this, like, it got wildly popular. And I think that the other element of the taxonomy, in addition to the uncertainty when you mentioned, is sort of like vagueness is part of it, but also just like a totally different framing. It's like I wouldn't,
Mm-hmm.
I would get a question, and the classic response to these questions is like, oh, this is one of those questions that's not even wrong. It's like I can't answer it because it doesn't contain enough structure inside of it
Mm-hmm.
that matches what I, as a like machine learning computer scientist or a neuroscientist, it doesn't match the way that I talk about things enough. So I would have to like immediately stop and re-explain, like take you on this historical journey through these 10 experiments, which I guess is the point of this podcast, right? Like go back on and tell this huge long narrative, right? To get to the point where I could say like, okay,
Yeah.
so what the real question that you're asking at this level is this nearby question. And so these questions, like, they're
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily wrong. Sometimes they're very overconfident, and that kind of makes me cringe when they're like these super overconfident explanations. But they're either vague or they're structurally weird or they're overconfident in a way that makes me want to do this big explanation of things, not so much in a way
Mm-hmm.
that is just like they don't claim to be uncertain. They might even claim to be certain. They might even claim to have the answer. But I'm like, but it just feels weird, and I want to re-explain a bunch of stuff. Do you have those examples of those that come to
Oh,
mind for you?
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I think, when you say that kind of overconfidence, explanations like dopamine
Oh
and
yeah. Oh my god.
all of the things that
Yeah.
they point at dopamine for, in very, very direct, clear, causal ways. I think sometimes the ones I see that seem like what you're describing as well are when maybe there's a folk construct or a very strong mental model that exists that is, again, as you say, not really how I would think about it. So you kind of have to redo the popular folk narrative or think
Mm.
about the paradigm itself in order to then get it, okay, what's really going on here, and then we can really engage productively with the question. So memory, it's many phenomena. So when you say, oh, something super specific, blah blah, long-term memory, let's have a conversation about this. Or these kind of very, as you say, sort of confident simple questions that again are grounded in folk understanding. So if someone says something like, if the amygdala is the fear center, what part of the brain controls love? I'm like, okay, the long pause is one fantastic question. I'm so delighted we're going to get to like
Yeah.
grapple with this idea together. However, I'm immediately hearing a folk psychology idea of what emotion is, and then localist takes on cognitive function, and we're going to have to unpack both of those ideas, and then we can really engage with what you're interested in understanding about the brain.
Well, I think that that also contains something. The way that you said that actually makes me think that that helps to answer kind of why these why is neuroscience this thing which got really popular, but we still but unexplained explanations still exist. Because you when you say if the amygdala is the fear center, what part of the brain controls love? I kind of want to answer like dorsal striatum, I guess, right? Like, but
Right?
also that's
Yeah,
the
there is an
like
answer.
there like I kind of can give an answer to it, but I'm like, but like it's the calling the amygdala fear center is a bad answer to that question, and this answer is the same kind of bad answer, right? But also,
Exactly.
and also, there's this. Okay, this is the one thing that I think is kind of wild in the way that I'm being asked the question is that the asker has a folk construct like love that they think is a
Mm-hmm.
brain property. They think that this thing understands brain
Yes.
property. Maybe I, as a neuroscientist, agree. Maybe I don't. Maybe I'm like, okay, what does that like? It's a real thing. It grounds out in something. We can unpack it. Neuroscience may have put a different lens on it. Looking at the brain is often a
Mm-hmm.
really cool way to take these existing ideas that we have and understand them in new and deeper ways. That's a cool way to look at it. But the asker, what's super wild to me about this, and one of the things that I kind of don't like being put in this position, the asker is asking me a question, but they don't see their knowledge about what love is as a theory of the brain. It exists in some other sphere. And so they're
Yes. Yeah.
asking me, tell me the real answer to this thing that I understand, which means they've already discounted their own understanding completely. Like, I can't even use
Mm-hmm.
their own understanding and feelings about love. I can't point to Shakespeare's poetry and be like, well, here's one of the interesting things going on. I actually did a machine learning analysis of like tone in Shakespeare's poetry at one point. And it's
Oh,
really
amazing.
interesting. It's a really interesting analysis, right? Putting these machine learning tools on top of that
Yeah.
old text gives you some really, you're like, wow, he's very good. He's very good at writing poems. Holy wow. Even the robots think he's great at it. That's like the folk understanding of what that concept of love comes from. But because of the way the question is asked, it's almost saying like, okay, but either that folk understanding has no basis in reality and isn't going to get explained and unpacked in a way that grounds out in the things that they already know about it, or and there's instead there's this real thing, and the answer is just going to be like this lump of neural tissue or something. It's like that, like what is the, what would that answer even do for you, right? How like, if I'm just like, I guess it's the dorsal striatum, like you don't know what the dorsal striatum even is. So the question is asked in a way where if I provide the easy answer, and the answer, the way it's been framed for me is to provide this easy answer, I don't even know, it will leave the audience still completely confused. It doesn't ground out in anything. And I think that's part of why we end up with this like popular neuroscience concept that's uncertain and vague and overconfident and overconstrained, because the way that people ask questions about it give answers that are only confusing, that don't actually help to explain what is going on in the argument about it. I guess the other thing that we talked a little bit about is there's also sort of like, this is maybe just us as people who have contact with kind of like college age students, but like there's a sort of identity formation thing going on there with college age students where they kind of want to like be the smartest and also like do the right thing and be the most productive and everything like that. So I often feel like there's a little bit of maybe like career ambition or pro-social activity wrapped up in the way they ask the question, like they're asking it about diseases. I think you probably are closer to that as someone who has done more disease research. My research, even in when I was working with humans, was mostly basic research sort of stuff on memory.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always this ethical dimension to our field that is tremendous and very multifaceted. It's probably going to come in very different ways with each of the topics that we're going to look at.
Yeah.
So, for me, I definitely see that kind of undertone sometimes, or that sense of like, well, just tell me what the right thing is, and right in an ethical sense, and that's a hard one because as a professor, it's not for me to put my normal perspective onto the world and onto our conversation. So we have to try to have very authentic conversations that recognize when we're assuming ethical considerations are at play, and just as you described earlier, recognize when we're engaging in theory driven behaviors or sort of perspectives. And we can do that about questions like, what is love? Well, that kind of implies ideas of emotion and taxonomies of stuff. And you can do it through this ethical sort of right thing to do lens as well. And for me, it's super important that we really think across like stakeholders and scales, if that makes sense. So really trying to think about individuals, but a breadth of individuals, a social level, and then sort of what's the point of all of this knowledge, and then who says how we use it and in what way, and how do we even grapple with these ideas of what the right thing to do is in this space. I think that spans everything from CS to AI to biology pretty directly. But there certainly is kind of that thirst for trying to find out what stance is going to be meaningful to each person. And you see that often kind of playing out in some of the lines of questionings, or just the framing of, well, we should look into this, or this understanding should be used to bring about this kind of outcome as well.
Yeah, this comes a lot in the AI ethics conversation, and it always feels kind of kind of like the amygdala situation above, where the desired outcome is like a list of right things to do, and that's just kind of not how ethics works. So you could kind of, but it does invite answering the question. It's like, maybe you shouldn't steal people's data, things like that. But it invites those kinds of questions. But there isn't just a list of right things to do that you can write down in these spaces. You have to actually like consider the actual circumstances in which you're doing things. Ethics is for stuff that hasn't happened yet, not stuff that's already happened. The discussion of the stuff that's already happened is like trying to guide our future behavior. And a lot of students, I feel like, really want to avoid that, really want to get to a point where they don't have to ever think about their future behavior anymore. They're kind of trying to like they're trying to pass the ethics exam. And then at that point, it's like, oh, good, I never have to think about it anymore because I'm an ethical person. I got the whole stamp. I don't think that actually is the way that they engage with it. But like it sometimes it feels that when the question is asked in that way, like what does an ethical AI look like, it affords me the desire to answer that question in the same way that I'd answer the like, okay, where's the love center of the brain? Like, okay, well, I can kind of give an answer, but like you don't want that answer. That's not the real answer you want.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing is that popular neuroscience is uncertain and vague, but also overconfident and at times over-constrained as well. So we have quite a breadth of challenges to grapple with. So
I guess I understand why. I guess I understand why we feel like people don't have a grasp on it, because if that's what it is, like, then yeah, it's ungraspable.
So then if this is what we're kind of grappling with, what does understanding, like heavy on the scare quotes, what
Yeah.
does understanding the brain mean to you, and does it matter?
Yeah, I guess the model that I usually use is I look at some other disciplines. I often use physics as a model because we don't understand everything about physics, and there's stuff that's not worked out. But we don't have the belief that physics is ununderstandable, right? That it is
Mm-hmm.
a discipline where no work has been done. And so, one of the things that I think really, and that's very interesting to me, especially in physics, because physics has very well developed quantitative models, and one of the things that's embedded in those quantitative models is actually kind of limits on knowledge. You can ask physics questions like, how hard will this bowling ball land on my foot if I drop it? Like, how much will it hurt? And physics can answer that question, but only if you also tell it the mass of the bowling ball. You can't just ask, it doesn't have the answer to questions in general. It says, if you give me the specific numbers that I need to plug in, I can give you the specific numbers that come out of these equations that make predictions about future things. And I actually think that in a lot of neuroscience areas, we have models that work pretty well like that we actually do have models where we can plug in specific numbers and tell you, like, this is the spiking behavior you'd see on this neuron, right? Those sorts of models all exist, and they're very well developed. They've been validated. They've been around for 60 years, but they don't give the same sort of feeling of understanding for some reason. And that has always been interesting to me, that the quantitative models in disciplines like physics and in chemistry that make these very accurate predictions um, aren't as kind of exciting in neuroscience. And so to me, because I found them very exciting and convincing in physics, one of the things is understanding those quantitative models, understanding their limits, understanding what kind of information you would still need to go out and like actually observe and gather. That would be a big that has always been a big kind of driver of understanding, and that's one of the reasons I'm in this more like machine learning quantitative side. I'm like, okay, show me, build me the machine that does this, right? And that would make me feel like I understand it pretty well. And the irony is, like, that's happening right now. Like, those machines are getting built, but this popular neuroscience conception is still like, it's still this vague and floaty thing. And I'm like, I don't know, guys. I can show you, like, do you want a cat detector? I can show you a cat detector, right? Like, and it detects cats using an algorithm that, while not directly based on biologically plausible neurons, the mathematics of it was inferred from studies of biologically plausible neurons. Like, the biology actually came first, and that to me is another big thing, that if your basic biological research is driving technical development, that seems to me like we have a pretty good handle on understanding how the system works. And so I think all that's happening right now, and it's so funny to me that it still doesn't quite give the juice of understanding to it. So I guess, like, what are some of the things that, so for me, that quantitative and that kind of engineering side stuff is very convincing,
Mm-hmm.
and that's one of the
Mm-hmm.
reasons I've kind of put my investment in that area of neuroscience. That was one of the things that drew me to it and got me excited about it. What sort of things make you feel like you understand neuroscience a little bit?
Oh gosh. So I think for me, there's like almost like two kinds of understanding. And I think it ties to what you've just been describing. There's kind of an easy understanding, which is this very direct, like maybe asking and answering a question at a single level of analysis. So like, what stimulus makes this neuron in the visual system spike in what way? And kind of can go and measure, and it's all sort of nice and direct, and we feel like we understand and it's clear. Then there's the harder understanding, which to my mind is typically kind of cross levels of analysis. And I think it's what people mean when they talk about understanding the brain and frame it as being a very hard problem. So I'm going to drop a couple of papers that we read in my Cogneuro class, because I think they will help unpack what I mean when I use the word understand, and it's probably going to come up again and again in our future conversations. So first, there's David Popple's work, and this is maybe a 10-year-old paper now, but it's the maps problem and the mapping problem. And he talks about them as being first a practical and then a principled problem. And the maps problem is basically what you describe as a practical problem of all of this work we've done making maps. And this is classic decade of the brain. They got fMRI, they imaged all of the things, they would have a behavior or cognitive function, they'd do the task in a scanner, they'd see the amygdala light up, maybe they thought it was fear, and you sort of make these localist representations and say, hey, we understand it, we see it lighting up. And Mar, Carandini, a couple others would say, well, you probably don't understand anything there. It's information that's very useful. It's a fantastic starting point to try to understand further what is going on in these cognitive processes. And it's a really useful piece of information. But if you're trying to say, understand speech and language, and you just get it, and you say, oh, these areas light up, that's not an explanation of it in sort of a thorough sense. Sort of practical, but there's this levels of analysis kind of problem going on. The other, I think, also ties to some of the questions we get, and it's this principled problem, and it's what they call the mapping problem. And there's a great phrase that I love to my students, and I think he says something like, it's granularity, mismatch, and the ontological incommensurability of misaligned parts lists, which is a very long-winded way of basically saying, look, you have a neuroscientist and a linguist, and they're talking to each other, trying to understand speech and language. And the linguist is saying things like morpheme and phoneme and noun phrase, and the neuroscientist is saying things like neuron and action potential and network. And there isn't, even in principle, like a mapping between this sort of set of constructs or primitives in the field. So you're trying to explain and understand, but there's kind of a bit of a bridge too far. So I think in this framework, explanatory connections or sort of understanding require us to craft really like computationally explicit linking hypotheses at the right level of abstraction. And this is why I keep in my classes going on and on about like what level of analysis are we talking about, sort of what scale, but what kind of abstraction and construct is in play. And this ties to another paper that we read that I think is even older now. It's probably maybe coming up on its 20th birthday the next couple of years. And this is Kendler's look at what does it mean when you make a statement like X is a gene for Y, particularly in neuropsychiatric disorders. So I studied schizophrenia in grad school. X is a gene for schizophrenia is a statement you would see that is one of those ones that makes me give a really big pause. And then there's a lot to unpack, multi-genes and risk factors and all of that. And the theme that Kendler would put forward is saying, if you're going to try to make these understanding, like causal, explanatory claims, you have to think of the strength of the association, the specificity. Is it one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one? What's going on? Is it contingent on something else? Is there causal proximity? And I think in neuroscience a lot, we're in long causal chains that we need to try to unpack. And then is it at the right level of explanation? And again, I think that's similar, but slightly different to what Popple was saying of, the Kendler classic example is, okay, you have an airplane, it's got all of these many, many parts in it. They're all interacting in very complex ways and the plane flies. And if you have, a problem with this one cable, it's not going to be able to fly. Is that cable like the cable for flying, or is it for something else? And I think that idea of level of abstraction really comes to the forefront when I want to talk about, can we explain this or understand what is going on and just be really honest about what we're talking about here. How about you? What is the sort of deep dive into this
Oh, hang
idea
on.
of
Can I observe one thing about I love your
Yes.
examples, and they kicked off something, made me think something, and it made me think a little bit about there's a little bit of a mismatch, I think, between what
Mm-hmm.
we as a scientist kind of want from a framework of knowledge and what the kind of popular desire for a framework of knowledge is. One of the examples you gave, actually, the linguist, the neuroscience of language speech example, I have this wonderful example that I always think about. And I guess this is a big part of when I try to understand a piece of science, I often say, okay, I have these canonical experiments. And instead of trying to explain how this works or summarize or give some kind of overview, I'm just like, let me just tell you about this experiment. So this will change the way you look at things, right? And I think that's part of what I, as a scientist, want. I want these things that kind of cause my knowledge to evolve on this. And that, when I think of something that is, oh, this really helped my understanding, it's kind of a direction. It's like a vector. It's like, this was something that really pushed me from having this set of beliefs to having this other set of beliefs. So it must be a very valuable piece of knowledge for someone to have, because it initiates this change. And the example I was thinking of is this wonderful imaging study by Gary Dell, who was trying to find where in the brain are phonemes, right? Which is, as you pointed out, kind of a weird question and things. And he acknowledges that it's sort of a weird question. But he also said, it's interesting to me because one of the places you might think phonemes are the kind of sounds that language make, ah, ooh, ee, things like that, are the vowels, and then you have t and k and stuff like that. And one region you might think is particularly interested in phonemes is the auditory cortex. And it turns out, not really, no. The auditory cortex mostly cares about frequencies, right? It cares about properties of sound. So, okay, another thing you might think is really interesting, is a particularly salient place to look for phonemes is the motor cortex. Because after all, you are generating phonemes, right? So you zoom in the motor cortex, maybe the motor cortex, because your tongue needs to move around to make these sorts of sounds. Turns out, no, the motor cortex also not super interested in phonemes. They aren't the sort of way that you need to move your mouth. It cares much more about transitions between phonemes, because that's actually what it needs to do. It actually needs to move your tongue around to make those sorts of things. But lo and behold, if you look in the somatosensory cortex, which is the part of your brain that cares about the position of your body, then it is a very good and this is a machine learning server trying to classify these different phonemes using fMRI data from these different regions. Turns out that the somatosensory cortex, especially like the mouth and throat and things like that, parts of the somatosensory cortex, lo and behold, very good at classifying phonemes. And when you look at that, you say, oh, of course that makes sense. Of course that makes sense. Because what the phoneme is it's like you have your tongue in a certain position and you're blowing air over it. And so the part of your body that cares about where is my body is this somatosensory thing. You don't hear them, you don't say them, you don't produce them, but you do sense when you are in the position that causes one. Of course that must be what's true. Now, whether or not that's actually right, I'm not sure that that's the be-all end-all of phonemes. I think that there's a lot of things. But man, that experiment really changes the way that I look at the whole question of what a phoneme is. The whole problem, it's a very different lens that you can put on that linguistic data. And the neuroscience is the thing that provides me with that lens. This experiment provided me with a different way of thinking about it. And the results, the data that you see is like, whoa, that totally, oh my goodness. I have to change how I think about all kinds of stuff now. Like all of these, not just in language, but all of these different, like, what, kind of cultural performances are somatosensory, right? Is suddenly something that I start thinking, which I wouldn't have thought before this research. And so to me, that shows that it's good research, not because it answers some question and now I never have to think about what a phoneme is again. Almost the opposite. It's like, oh, no. Now my whole worldview is destabilized and bad, and I have to start thinking about radically different ways of looking at things like that. So to me, that's another marker of what makes a really good piece, a good element of understanding. It's like this critical experiment that really, it's not that it answers my question, it's almost that it kind of like melts down a lot of the questions that I had and changes the way and forces me to think about those through a different lens. And so I really like those as kind of canonical experiments rather than any kind of summary that someone might give to me. It wouldn't actually do as much work for someone to just kind of come along and be like, hey, phonemes are in the somatosensory cortex. Like, I'd be like, are they though? Like, compared to what? Like, is the auditory, right? So seeing it laid out in that way, it's like, of course that's right. Of course that's right. And incidentally, the thing that I end up on is not very surprising to me, sort of. Like, once I've gone through the trajectory, I'm like, how stupid not to have thought of that. Mm-hmm. Right. But of course, it's hard to actually think of those sorts of things. So, yeah. Do you have other, like, canonical experiments that you use to kind of structure your knowledge? What is the... Do those do work?
I mean, we could probably go on all
Yeah.
day on canonical experiments. One that I quite enjoy talking about with my students is not so much a canonical experiment, but almost a very common question. And there's a lot of popular articles about it, and it's, can you detect lies on brain scans? Or
Mm-hmm.
the converse, like, will brain scans become the new polygraph? And they're going to be so precise. And there's a lot of sci-fi that gets into this. And I love the question because when you pause and start to examine it, it almost starts to like fall apart on two fronts, or you have to recognize, as you said, that there's much more complexity going on
Right.
here than initially meets the eye, both with the question and with the answer. And with the question, you're like, okay, well, a lie. What is a lie? How do we study a lie? Okay, well, you probably have to get people to come into a lab and instruct them to lie. Is an instructed lie what we're actually calling a lie, or what we're interested in understanding, in the wild, or not? There's arguments that would say, well, actually, probably not. That could be, cognitively a little different. So then you have to try to get people to spontaneously lie. Well, is that still what we're getting at or not? Because it might not be. So now we have to get people to spontaneously lie and kind of have some risk reward going on, probably. Because usually we're interested in lies that matter, I guess, in this context. So there has
Mm-hmm.
to be some risk thing going on. And so now we're like 3 layers deep into engineering an experiment. And I would say, like, questions now arise about what are we actually having people do, and is this really, the behavior of interest? Then let's get into what's happening, as our brain lights up in the scanner. And this is back to that emotion question on love. Like, what is a lie? Is a lie a thing? Like, this doesn't feel like we're in the realm of natural kinds. It feels like we're
Yeah.
very far from, fundamental things that are independent of human labels and, our desire to draw boxes around things and describe them. So then you kind of go, yeah, there's not going to be like the lying center of the brain. Instead, we're suddenly realizing we have to look at like a whole basket of markers of things like, oh, we see regions that may be related to things like decision under risk, or sort of like risk reward contingencies, anticipatory regret, or things like that coming to light. Just cognitive load. Like in theory, if you're lying, you're having to keep things straight and get right. So
Yeah.
it suddenly breaks down into about like 5 or 6 almost different components, or like cognitive markers or cognitive processes. So now we're saying, okay, we have a thing that we just have a super straightforward label for that is probably not just a thing in that kind of way. And then this sense of, can we authentically investigate it given some of the paradigms and tools that are readily at our disposal? And that kind of complexity and how it sort of gets multifaceted on both fronts, I think, is something that has really shaped how I read a lot of imaging papers, or just how I really think about the short answers to some of these questions that we get asked.
Yeah, I think that that's a great example too, because there's a big question. One of the things that kind of sits with me about, like, will we ever understand, like, what are kind of the limits, or what's the range of understanding, what's within the scope of what we're going to work out about neuroscience. When I think about things like constructs, those definitely aren't going to get worked out by neuroscience. Those are things that we know we will not know. We know we will not find the answers to in this sort of thing. And so in part of it is what you've laid out with lies. Like, what this thing is itself a construct, and we have the machinery to change what we mean by it. And so if you ask the question, what is, and then you point to something that we have the machinery to change the meaning of, you haven't really pointed it. Like, you point to a huge spectrum, right? Does Prince Hamlet die? I mean, yes, but also no. He's totally fictional. He's made up, right? It's like, okay, if you have a slightly different definition of lying, right, you're going to have to do a 10-year study. And every other
Yep.
person who also has a slightly different definition of lying is going to have to do a 10-year study. And we're never going to get anywhere, right? You can ask the question, but research in that direction can't be meaningful, because all it would be doing is nailing down one particular little constructed definition of something and not actually giving insight into the larger thing.
Yeah, and I think that almost comes to this question, do I care if I don't fully understand? And I'll be really honest and I'll say, in a lot of contexts, probably not. I think we still make very meaningful progress without necessarily getting too concerned about all of these kind of complexities across levels of analysis that's taking place. And if I'm straight up with my students, I say, look, I did an entire PhD studying schizophrenia, and I came away with an even greater appreciation for what we don't understand about schizophrenia. And that was wonderful progress so far. I mean, I'm biased, but that was wonderful progress so far as I'm concerned. And I think it actually meant I had a much greater appreciation of the kinds of considerations that we're talking about. Like, what does it really mean to ask this question? What kind of individual differences are we talking about here? What complexity is tractable, and what, we may not be able to fully untangle, but we can still look more broadly at, okay, this intervention, this kind of outcome and that kind of thing. So I tell my students, to borrow from Transport for London, please mind the gap. And by that I
Right.
mean, be aware of these distinctions in levels of explanation and constructs and what's theory driven. Acknowledge it, but at the same time, it's not necessarily a huge impediment so long as we're aware of it, and accurately reframe and try to avoid some of the pitfalls that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I
How about
think.
you? Like, sort of,
Oh, I was going to say,
yeah.
I just think
Where are
that
we with understanding?
what that does for me. Well, I think that one of the things that, I mean, maybe this is something that gets enculturated when you're in that a research area, but you get really excited to find out that things the I think when you approach a discipline and you don't know much about that discipline for the first time, when you're first getting into it, it seems like, well, there must not be anything known. And really what you're saying is, I don't know anything about that discipline. But then when you're a PhD student, you've studied it for 10 years, you're like, there is nothing to do. Everything is worked out. And so you get really excited when you're like, wait a minute. I found out that there are actually two slightly different variants of schizophrenia. Maybe I can make my home in one of these, right? And then I can publish a paper, right? Like, so it's this difference in attitude where when you find these areas that are within the scope of what you think you could address with research, right? They don't fall out into that realm of like, we're not going to know if Hamlet's real or fake, right? Or like, we're not going to know whether Hamlet dies because that's like, it's a semantic question more or less. But they're actually, with tools you can address them. But you do feel like, but I'm not sure anyone's been here before, which is actually not that hard to find. But it's this narrower thing. It's like you have this kind of, you've drawn this circle around what you are going to find. And then as you zoom in on it as a graduate student, you find these little subdomains. And you're like, hey, no one's colored here. And then you can do a little coloring there. And then, the generation that comes after you zooms in on what you've colored and be like, you totally missed this corner up here. I'm going to color in that corner. And that's kind of the way that the knowledge gets filled in. And so I really like you talking about that. We were going to talk a little bit about kind of research methods and key points kind of to set up future podcast episodes. So what are some of the kind of you've talked a little bit of some of the methods and the scales that you approach the brain at, and also just sort of like what is the kind of your education? How did you go through this process of like, okay, I didn't understand the brain. Here's how I understand more about it. And now if I was going to try to understand other stuff, this is kind of the framework that I would take with me to go into these future episodes.
Yeah, so I think, how do I approach the brain? Well, it's a product of my more interdisciplinary undergrad and then my sort of more sort of neuroscience-y PhD. So I think of kind of biological and psychological processes at a series of scales that are grounded nonetheless in some of the computational perspectives that you talked about earlier. Because I don't want to stray, too far from, what is this architecture actually doing? And I think of them as being wrapped up in some philosophical questions, sort of like the construct, the theories, some of those ideas. To be honest, a lot of the questions I've asked and answered, we've kind of ignored the philosophical questions for the purposes of digging into conducting these experiments, but they're useful to just remember that they're kind of lurking there. As we talk, the smaller the scale or kind of the lower the level of analysis, the more biological I'm likely to be, or sort of biological and computational. The higher the level of analysis or the bigger the scale, the more kind of abstract or psychological I'm going to be. So like talking about things with just big labels like, it's executive function or it's working memory. I call myself more of like a neuroscientist rather than a psychologist because I really care what is concretely in the substrate underneath those labels, like the networks, the biological processes, pieces like that. But, I did take some philosophy in there and, consciousness, it's weird and wonderful, even though we sort of usually agree to, not think about it in the day-to-day sense as we get on with our research. But there's certainly a really interesting questions there, or times when it's like, okay, like bring in the philosophers, let's go. We, got to look at it in that kind of way. How about you?
Yeah, I think that that is also broadly, I think that there is a general thought of when you're at kind of lower levels, it's easier to understand kind of the computation of mathematics, the biological systems of it. You understand it a little bit more like, kind of a little flow diagram, a little mechanistic process. And as you get higher and higher, you're kind of you're getting into these levels of abstraction. So I agree with that way of looking at it. I kind of have a stack, and we might talk about some of these things, of different scales of thing that you could build. So starting with this like very low level neuroethological feedback loops. One of the things I assign my students is Valentino Breitenberg's Vehicles book, which I think is a really lovely way to look at very, very simple nervous systems interacting with the world. Moving from that into something like a Hodgkin-Huxley neuron and like Hebbian LTP, kind of Eric Kandel stuff. That's like, okay, so now imagine you actually wanted to build these with a little bit more sophistication, right, and get them to learn a little bit. Then usually going into like receptive field stuff, like Hubble and Wiesel and Nadel and the place field stuff. And at about that point, that's where I would kind of bring in the more computational, the mesoscale networks, like the functional networks that you get out of kind of neural network construction, like Mikkel and Rummel and that sort of stuff. And then from there, this is where it kind of moves over into this, I think, a more interesting kind of psychological discipline side, where there's some general neuroanatomy that you can know, at this point. And you can start to look at stuff like some of the larger electrical phenomena like oscillations, like neurooscillations, which is something we might talk about. But that's kind of the level at which you are transitioning over into a discussion, for me, a discussion of stuff that is more construct driven and more historical and more kind of doing this thing, which I don't want to. I think that generally speaking, the people who come from the bottom and work their way up that stack of the scale of the amount of brain in question, they tend to reach this point where they're like, well, everything above this point is a mere fiction. And I think that that is wrong because then those same people go and they buy coffee with $5 fictional dollars, and they exist, they use language, right, and only English language or something like that to communicate. So they are awash in the pure fictions of kind of a humanist life. And so understanding the gap and filling in those actual, grounding out those actual things, even if they are understood to be like, historically grounded in part, and that you can change your definitions and change things around a little bit, but there are good, better and worse interpretations of the way that those things work out. And to simply say like, well, because it's an interpretation, I don't care, I think is the wrong way to be at that level. I think I care very deeply about there being, good interpretations, not bad ones, and thoughtful ones, and ones that are grounded in evidence and not grounded in navel gazing. And I think that the tendency, and one of the things I like about working with neuroscientists, is that they also kind of care about that transition. Like they don't just throw up their hands at it and they think it's interesting to study. Mm-hmm. So I think that those are the things. I start from this very like biological stack. That's been very compelling to me. But I don't want to give the impression that because I start from that position, I think that it's all malarkey past this. I feel like there's kind of a malarkey line that exists for certain kinds of, very often, computer scientists who want everything to ground out in these very understandable processes. And I guess it just haven't read the distributed processing literature because it makes it very clear that like, oh man, it's really hard. So that's my feeling on that stack. Yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
I really appreciate your framing of kind of that transition point, because I think it actually comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of that idea of like popular questions and unpopular answers. And, we want to be able to make meaningful understanding that sort of fits at that popular level of like the love question, mm-hmm. or other things we've talked about before. And I think if I'm only talking in the language of action potentials and neurons, I'm probably failing at not just the science communication, but even like my work having a purpose that is bigger than just some basic science in the lab. And I think that sense of how do we actually ensure that meaning making is taking place is very important. And I certainly think of some of my friends and colleagues in the field, as you say, they're very interested in that line and don't want to just sort of poo-poo or sort of not talk to the people that are more sort of in the philosophical cognitive psychology traditions, because there's so much we can learn. They can really help with that framing of what are the interesting questions to ask and how do we make sense of what we find when we start doing some of these experiments in the lab as well.
I also think that there's this it would be lovely if we could get folks who have these kind of, who are talking in the areas of like, what's the love region of the brain? Like they have to understand that they are talking about neuroscience stuff and mm-hmm. to regard their own understanding of things with some level of stakes. I think that the one of the things that has always made me feel almost like scared to be a neuroscientist is that people would ask me things and I would be like, I can answer your question by saying a Latin word that you don't know.
Yeah.
And you will consider your question answered by me and give me like mm-hmm. additional power and authority over your understanding of love, right? Things that are as core to you as like your understanding of various emotions. And you are just like, here, take it from me. I'm like, I will not pick that up. That seems like a wild thing to do. And one of the reasons I want people to understand neuroscience is so that they don't feel that way, that they say like, well, I mean, like, sure, that part of the brain, but that doesn't really, like, I have like, can you explain all this poetry? Can you explain all these sunsets, right? Like, I'm like, okay, good. Now you're understanding it is like, now you can hold my feet to the fire a little bit. That's the kind of understanding I want people to have. And I guess in the modern day, what you do when you you have that desire is you make a podcast that dunks on airport books. And so that's why we're here. So there is actually a lot of kind of cool, interesting, popular media out there that touches on neuroscience issues. We wanted to kind of highlight some of the ones that we thought were particularly fun or interesting, whether that's a nonfiction book, a movie, a TV show, something like that that brushed on the issue, and just spend a few minutes discussing the themes of that topic and reacting to it so that we could kind of contextualize that and start to join it to this project that we're doing. So, Katie, you had a book that you wanted to highlight on this one.
Yeah, and I'll bet you think it's going to be Oliver Sacks, and it's not, but that might come up in a future
Yes.
episode.
Oh, good. Job
This one
security.
is called Do No Harm. It's stories of life, death, and brain surgery, and it's Henry Marsh's sort of memoir. He was a brain surgeon in the United Kingdom, a very long career, very sort of preeminent surgeon. And it's really fascinating because I think it weaves together some of those dimensions we talked about before, where there's, some of the fundamental neuroscience of he's describing, okay, if there's a tumor in this region, this is the indication. But then it's a very human perspective on it. So back to the ideas of ethics and morality and motive and that we talked about before. And he really, talks about having to work with his patients and really help people navigate very challenging circumstances and very challenging choices. And this gets into those questions from that ethical lens of what is an appropriate intervention and what are outcomes and all of that I think we can weave together in a lot of topics of cognitive disorders and neurodegenerative diseases.
I love that. I have not read this. I will have to read this. This sounds like a great encounter. I did a little bit of epilepsy modeling at one point, and I got to talk to epileptologists and neurosurgeons who would work in this area, and they are wild. I do not have the constitution for this, because we were in some of the models that we were talking about. We were talking about using small amounts of stimulation, like millivolt level stimulation. I was like, is that going to be safe? And they were like, we routinely remove like hemispheres, like because we have to, because people would die if we didn't do it.
Yeah.
And the amount the scale of the choice that they have to make in those situations is daunting to someone who's like on the research side. We are I respect them for doing it. I'm glad I'm in
yeah.
my chair. I'm happy in my chair. Woo! So that sounds great. That's an awesome book. I guess the good segue in this, I will do a movie recommendation, which is the most straightforward and favorable movie recommendation that builds right on top of a neurosurgery example, which is Memento, Christopher Nolan's Memento, which is one of the best cinematic depictions of what amnesia is actually like. The character in Memento, Lenny, the main character, has anterograde amnesia, which means he cannot form new memories, or he cannot be aware of the new memories that he's forming. He can learn new skills and things like that, but he can't. He doesn't know what just happened to him. And the movie is really brilliant construction, which is shot backwards, so that you see the end of the movie first, and mirroring his experience slowly work your way back to what the scene by scene to the way that this chain of events kicked off. It depicts a very similar etiology to a patient who is extremely famous in the history of neuroscience, who is patient HM, who had faced one of these difficult / impossible neurosurgical choices, where he had intractable epilepsy in both of his hippocampi and the hippocampuses. It's Greek. And this was the first time the surgery was done, but they were removed bilaterally, and afterwards he had this condition where he couldn't form new memories, or couldn't form new representations of things that had happened to him. And so it's a really cool movie, and I think a good depiction of kind of some of the really interesting stuff that can happen with brains, which are maybe more interesting than the kind of some of the narratives that we have about like, oh, how amnesia works. This is like, no, this is how amnesia works. It's much weirder than just Jason Bourne can't remember his name. It's way weirder than that. Yeah. It's way more interesting. It makes a way better movie. So I wanted to recommend that one.
That's a fabulous recommendation. Yeah, as you say, very much a beloved film in the academic community for sure. I think my PhD supervisor in Cambridge even did some like speaking engagements about like the film. Yeah. Like they'd watch the film and then he'd kind of do this unpacking, and as you say, HM is just one of those absolutely canonical clinical cases I think every student encounters sort of very early on as, an example of like almost paradigm forming research intervention.
Yeah,
So that
we
is
might
a
do a whole
fantastic
episode.
recommendation.
Might have to do a whole episode on that series of
We
amnesia
probably
research.
could.
It is a soap opera.